Hi, we now get to the final church, the seventh church, in the seventh letter that Jesus writes to his church at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Perhaps this may be the one that we have to watch the most. Let's do a quick recap. God wants us to get love right with Him. It's the most important love relationship in our life. He wants us to get it right before we serve our dish, right? He wants us to get it right before we meet Him for eternity. He wants us to get it right before we hit the end of our life and we enter into a life with Him. So some of the points that we looked at before was, one, we have to be careful that we don't lose our first love. Then he talks to the church about suffering for Him, having like a realistic view of love. 3, we're asked to not compromise. Don't compromise. Then 4, we look at not just for show. That means we don't live our Christian life just for the external or the reputation. And our last session, we looked at the positive letter to the Church of Philadelphia, and we were asked to have patient endurance. But now we get to Laodicea, the final one. This is a church that is self-sufficient. All right? It's a wealthy church. It can handle itself. It's much like the Western church or churches in developed countries where we've got air conditioning, cool projectors, fancy videos. We're fine, right? Things are going well. We're not under terrible persecution. We're not like that church that is suffering and people are being martyred to death. Because let me say that even in the world today, there are Christians that are giving up their lives for God. But this church, things are fine. The main complaints are, what is the menu for lunch after church? How come the service went for too long? The pastor's joke's not funny enough, whatever it is. Most of the issues they face, they don't really need the Lord to solve them. In fact, you'll find in this church, they're not willing to stretch themselves into areas of great risk at all. Safety is important for this church. They don't want to be too hot and they don't want to be too cold, right? That's the analogy. There's an analogy of water that's being used to describe this church. It is this bland, middle of the road gray, that where you're polite, you're safe, and it's a mixture that doesn't need God and actually ends up not being useful for the kingdom. You see, if you're hot, there's a use for hot water. And if you're cold, there's a use for cold water. But God says to this church, I will spit you out of my mouth because you're lukewarm. In fact, in this letter that is addressed to the Church of Laodicea, you get the very, very famous passage in Revelation 3:20. Maybe you've heard it. It goes like this. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him and he with me. Now this verse is often misunderstood because we think that it's a verse that says, hey, anybody can invite Jesus into their life, into their heart, right? Because Jesus is the polite gentleman and he's knocking at the door. Oh, please let me in, let me in. And we think that it's as if it's us inviting Jesus into our life and our house. But if you look at the biblical context of this passage, if you look at the parables that Jesus tells about the master that has gone away and then returns, what you discover is that it is the owner of the house that returns. That when Jesus is knocking at the door, He's knocking at the door of His creation, of His house, the world that belongs to Him. And so then, if you are a lukewarm Christian, if you're the Church of Laodicea, and you have no need for Jesus, you sit behind that door, you hear Jesus knocking, and you go, it's okay, I'm fine. No thanks. You're not welcome here. And the owner of the house doesn't get invited in. And then we get to the book of Revelation. And we get to the end of some of these parables that Jesus tells. Do you know what happens to the owner of that house who decides that they don't need Jesus? They're okay by themselves. They actually end up losing that house because it wasn't their house. They end up losing the talent because they're holding tight to the talent. You get to the book of Revelation and we see that the world as we know it, that has rejected Jesus, the world as we know it gets destroyed. Why is the book of Revelation so grim and why is it so dramatic? It's because the owner of the house who comes back for it gets rejected. And I think that's a warning to all of us in today's modern church, is that we become so self-sufficient, okay with our own lives and our own issues, that we don't really need Jesus. I hope we'll take some time in this session to look at it, because this one is particularly important. God bless.